Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist Church. I'm glad you could be with me today. We're continuing our study in the book of Isaiah and the prophecies of Isaiah, the different things that he said, that God gave him the words to say. The title of our lesson this time says God reigns. God controls the rise and fall of nations and powers. And it is, they talk about in our book a number of chapters from the last chapter that we covered, which was more towards the beginning of Isaiah. Let me tell you what that one was. And so we've moved forward now to chapter 23. And so we skipped quite a few chapters there. And in those chapters, it talks a lot about different nations and prophecies that Isaiah made about those nations. I would like to think about the title of this lesson for a minute, and after reading through it, I came to the conclusion that it's sort of like, you could rename it the power of God over the gods, if you wanted to name it that. It brought back some things to my mind, and so I thought I'd share a couple things with you. Here in America, we don't have, well, we do have it, but you don't see on a daily basis people who are serving other gods. Not often. I mean, you might see, if you go to a nail salon, if the person is Buddhist, you might see a Buddha there or something like that. But in Africa, we saw evidence of this daily as we went through the day. And it might be a charm that someone had put on their baby to protect their baby from evil spirits. The face markings that had been cut into the faces of people to protect them from the gods. And many, many other things. And even when we would go into the home of a pastor, we would always look over the door, because sometimes there would be bundles of twigs and things that were put there as a protection for the house. And you could sort of know the status, I guess, of that pastor, and how that you needed to work with them to try to encourage them to learn more and know more by seeing that. And there were often, incidences where someone was said to have put a curse on someone. There were witch doctors. A witch doctor is a person who gives you a potion, maybe, to protect you against the curse that might have been put on you by a witch. I mean, it's very complicated. And then we had a time when one of the pastor's wives came to me and talked to me, and she said that someone had put a curse on her to draw her back to Islam, because she had been a Muslim. She and her husband had been Muslims many years ago before they became Christians, and he later became a pastor. And she said that they had put this curse on her and on her sister to draw her back to Islam, and that her sister had already gone back. And she was afraid. She was genuinely afraid that this curse was going to work, and it was going to somehow draw her out of Christianity and back into Islam. So this is, it's a very real thing to people. And, we might say, oh, well, those other gods don't really exist. They're not real. But we don't really know. It could be demonic influences there that is a very real thing, Sometimes, surely, some of it's made up, and people have been convinced, though, that it's so real that it affects their life in many, many ways. And I think even here in America, we have gods that people serve, but we just don't call it that. And we could possibly think of examples, of that. And so, getting back then to the time of Isaiah, this section that I'm talking about, he's just gone through, and you can look at it and you'll see prophecies about Moab, Edom, Arabia, different countries or different nations that were in the area. And this section is referred to sometimes as the oracles against the nations, or judgments on the nations. In this area and at this time, the gods, there were many gods. People served many gods, just like I was talking about in Africa and many other countries. That happens. And those gods were thought to be territorial. They had an area that they, were powerful in. And when they went outside that area, they weren't as powerful as when they were in their own home area. And so these prophecies that Isaiah made about these other nations were prophecies not necessarily against the gods, though sometimes they were, but they were showing God's power, the real true God, the one God. They were showing his power over all of those other nations, and in that way showing his power over their gods as well, and showing that people should trust in the one true God. And so we come to the last of this section of oracles against the nations, and the last one that was together with that section is about the city of Tyre. And there were two coastal cities called Tyre and Sidon. They were not very far apart, and they were major merchant cities where ships went out to other places and came back with goods, and it was traded and all of that. They were very wealthy cities. And so this very last pronouncement that Isaiah made about the different nations in this section was against Tyre. And he talks about how Tyre is going to be brought down and how it's going to be destroyed. And he also talks about Sidon in with it, and how those countries, or not countries, but cities, are going to be destroyed. And it would be equivalent to if someone came to a large city in America, New York City, let's say, where the stock market is and all of that, and begin to make a pronouncement that, hey, this city is going to be wiped out and it's going to be no more. You can imagine how people would view that as ridiculous. No way. This is too powerful. It can't be brought down. It's not going to. People may say things like that. The cities of Tyre and Sidon were known for the worship of the god Baal, and you hear Baal pretty often in the Bible. The people who lived there were called Phoenicians. And so let's read the first verse that we're going to focus on today. And that's in chapter 23 of Isaiah. And we're going to start with verses 8 to 10. Who has planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honored of the earth? The Lord of hosts has planned it, to defile the pride of all beauty, to despise all the honored of the earth. Overflow your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more restraint. Okay, so in verse 8, Isaiah is referring to Tyre as the bestower of crowns, whose merchants are princes. So these people who were doing this trade and everything, they were extremely wealthy. They were treated as princes. They may have even worn crowns, who knows? But they were extremely wealthy and powerful people. And so he starts off there with a question: who has planned this destruction against Tyre? And then he answers the question: the Lord of hosts has planned it. And through all of these judgments against the nations, it's showing that God He has power over the affairs of nations, not just the nation of Israel, but all the nations of the world. He has power over the affairs that happen. And it's important for us to remember that we know it, but we need to be reminded of these things from time to time, and to realize that God is all powerful. He has His hand at work in so many places in the world. In verse 10, then, he refers to overflowing your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. And there was a big debate in the teacher's book, about exactly where Tarshish was. And the conclusion that this author came is that it's likely a place in Spain. It was a far reach for the market and trade of ocean trade. It was a place that people went to, but it was far. And you might remember the story of Jonah, where he was told by God to go to Nineveh, and he got on a ship headed for Tarshish. So that was another reference to that same place. So in other words, he was trying to get out of there and go a long way away to a different place and hide from God. And so when Isaiah refers here to daughters of Tarshish overflowing their land, he's basically saying that Tyre and Sidon are going to be wiped out by invaders from other places, and that they will be no more. And then in verses 11 and 12, let's read those. He has stretched his hand out over the sea. He has made the kingdoms tremble. The Lord has given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. He has said, you shall exult no more, O crushed virgin daughter of Sidon. Arise, pass over to Cyprus. Even there you will find no rest. And it says in our book that the Canaanite fortresses that it refers to here is also a reference to Tyre, the Phoenician people that lived there. And so, he's re-emphasizing that, hey, God has stretched out his hand over all the nations, and he has made the kingdoms tremble. In other words, it is a fearful thing to think about that the all-powerful God, the one who holds all power, has declared that your nation would crumble or be wiped out. that would be a fearful thing for us here in America, would it not? If people begin to make that pronouncement against our country. Imagine how that might feel to you. And this was the thing that was happening there. And of course, maybe they just thought Isaiah was crazy, but his prophecies, came true. And I'm sure in the end, they didn't think he was nearly as crazy as maybe they did in the beginning. He even talks about they could flee to the island of Cyprus, but they will not be able to get away from the power of God, even in that place. And again, that's kind of a reference to the territorial way that they looked at their gods as being rulers of a territory, and then that they might not be powerful if you got away from them. And I guess, Jonah, that may harken back to that also, the idea of running away, from God. Let's look at verses 13 and 14 then. Behold the land of the Chaldeans, this is the people which was not. Assyria appointed it for desert creatures. They erected their siege towers, they stripped its palaces, they made it a ruin. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold is destroyed. Okay, so he's referring to the Chaldeans in this, which was a country that was alongside a people group occupied the area of Babylon, which was south of the Assyrians. And the Assyrians had attacked and torn down the cities. When they tear down the cities, the walls, the city walls may have been built out of large stones, and they actually, took hooks and pulled those down so that they could enter the city, invade the city. And you can get an idea of that sort of thing, on the movies, on the Lord of the Rings. They made movies in which they did similar sorts of things, attacking. Of course, it was had some fantastical elements to it, but still you can get the idea of what it might have looked like when they did this, when they built their sieges. In other words, they'd come outside your wall there and build up a scaffolding, I guess you might say, to climb up and pull down the wall again so that they could invade the city. So these were all things that, were added to show Tyre that, hey, look at what happened to the Chaldeans, and the same sort of thing is about to happen to you. Your stronghold is being destroyed. Now let's go on to verses 15 and 16. Now in that day Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king. At the end of 70 years it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. Take your harp, walk about the city, O forgotten harlot. Pluck the strings skillfully, sing many songs, that you may be remembered. And so in this section, it's talking about how Tyre is going to be wiped out and forgotten for 70 years. And it also refers to Tyre as a harlot. And in other places here, it refers to them in that way. In other words, that the business that they were doing was, maybe you might say, prostituting themselves in the way that they did business, if that makes sense. Because, they maybe threw aside all of their moral standards in order to conduct business. And we certainly see that happen even today when people don't regard, others. They don't regard the poor. They don't regard the environment. People that have the drug companies that just keep raising the prices up and up and up without regard, And so I think that application could also be made in many ways, even today. And it has this song of the harlot, basically talking about how Tyre is going to be remembered no more, and is going to try to come back and become remembered, I guess you might say. And then let's read verses 17 and 18. It will come about at the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre. Then she will go back to her harlot's wages and will play the harlot with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. Her gain and her harlot's wages will be set apart to the Lord. It will not be stored up or hoarded, but her gain will become sufficient food and choice attire for those who dwell in the presence of the Lord. And there was a little debate in the book about the meaning of that last little section there, talking about how the wages of the citizens of Tyre were ultimately going to be dedicated to the Lord, and what that means. Whether that means that they're going to try to make a comeback, and then, the nations of Israel and Judah are going to overcome them or whatever and take away their wealth and have it for themselves, or what, so that there's some speculation in the book about what that might mean. But I think the thing that we can take away from this lesson today is a very good reminder for ourselves that the God that we serve is all powerful. And in the affairs of our country and every other country, He has His will to be done. We might not see that happening, and we might see wickedness prevail. We've talked about that before, when it looks like all is lost, or it looks like wickedness is prevailing. But God is at work to cause things to happen in the way that He wants to guide history in the direction that He wants it to go. And there is no other God who is powerful like that. There may be a demonic force that some people have chosen to serve. There may be a God that really doesn't exist at all that people have chosen to serve. They're all desperately, seeking for power, and to try to have power over their situation. But with us, it's different, because the God that we serve, we don't have to try to seek to have power over our situation. We just have to serve God and trust Him that He has power over our situation, and He will see us through it in the best way possible. So I think I'm going to conclude there. Thank you for joining me this week. And next week we're going to jump over, I'll tell you, so that you can go ahead. We'll jump over to chapter 25 next week, so you may want to read that ahead of time. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.